day. Today's video must start with the desperately sad, tragic news from Moscow, where a horrific terrorist attack has been conducted in the suburb of Krasnogorsk, in a place called the Crocus City Hall, which is, as I understand it, actually a venue, a music and entertainment venue, and in which a group of terrorists, like anybody would dispute that description of them, entered this hall, this place, this building, where a rock concert was apparently being conducted, and systematically and cold-bloodedly murdered large numbers of people. We don't, I think, yet have the final death toll, but as of the time of the making of this program, it stands at a horrifying 133. In addition, large numbers of people were wounded. The venue was set on fire intentionally by the people who carried out this violent, murderous terrorist act. And interestingly and importantly, after having carried out this attack, they fled. There were some reports early on over the course of this incident that the attackers had barricaded themselves in part of the building, but it's now clear that that was not true. And I will anticipate further what I'm going to say later in this program, which is that the Russian authorities are now claiming that they have actually captured the 4 terrorists. They said that it was 4 terrorists who carried out this attack, and 11 other individuals who the Russians believe were involved, and that they're in the process of conducting a further investigation to determine the entire network that was behind this attack. Well, the first thing one must say when an incident like this happens is that this is an absolutely horrifying and appalling incident, and it is also a personal tragedy, a tragedy for the people who were killed, a tragedy for the people who were wounded, a tragedy for the families of these people. And one must feel deep commiserations for their families and hope and pray that they will have the support that they require at this desperately terrible time. The second thing that one must say after an incident like this is that it was carried out with a ruthlessness and a savagery which is absolutely horrifying, and which I have to say is not unprecedented in the events of the last 30 years, but still makes one shudder. At least it makes me shudder with horror and astonishment. Now, I am not in this program going to start analysing and discussing the incident itself. I don't think that there is any value in my doing that. You can get breakdowns as to exactly what happened, how the terrorists drove up to the venue, how they entered the venue, the way they conducted the attack. There are lots of places, better places than mine, my program, where that kind of forensic discussion of this attack takes place. I'm not going to engage in it. I don't think it is an appropriate thing for me, inexpert as I am in these matters, to do. And besides, I have difficulty myself taking apart and analysing in that kind of way an incident of this kind. But I'm going to say a number of things. The first is that I do not know who these people who carried out this terrible thing were. I'm not going to say in this program that I pretend I do, and it is always essential over the course of an incident like this to take stock and wait and wait for the official reports, which we will be getting shortly from the Russian authorities, and that will make it much more possible to take an informed view of the perpetrators and of how they went about carrying out this thing. There is also the further point that does need to be made, which is that obviously there is presumably going to be a legal process now underway. The Russians claim that they have captured the perpetrators. Presumably charges will be brought, some kind of legal action will be taken, and it is important that those procedures are followed, and anybody who is, of course, accused of anything is entitled to all the protections that a proper legal process provides. I know that it is sometimes unpopular to make that point in the aftermath of an incident like this, but it is nonetheless important to say it. Now, having said that, I am not going to try to second guess the decisions, the views of the Russian authorities, the claims that the Russian authorities are going to make, or the results of the investigation, or the results of any legal process. I am going to make a number of observations about some of the events that have happened, which might provide certain important clues. Now, the first is that reports were circulating late last night and early this morning about a claim made by ISIS, the well-known terrorist group, Islamist terrorist group, that they were responsible for this particular attack. And I have to say that there are some aspects of this attack which do lend one to the view that it might indeed have been them. Firstly, its extreme savagery and ruthlessness. Secondly, the fact that the target that was selected was the softest possible target, a venue where there were large numbers of, one assumes, young people, revelers, people who had no role in any kind of political or global events, people who were civilians, who would have been unarmed, and were attacked in a cold-blooded and murderous way. And that, I have to say, is consistent with the way certain of these Middle Eastern terrorist groups, ISIS and Al-Qaeda, have operated in the past. Now, having said that, I think there is a few things to say. Firstly, in terms of acts of terrorism, ISIS has not been particularly active outside the Middle East for a long time. The organization was, to put it mildly, very, very badly affected by the series of military defeats it began to suffer after about 2015. In Syria, the Russians and the Syrian army broke its back in central Syria, in central and eastern Syria, in places like Palmyra and Deir ez-Zor. And, of course, its capital, Raqqa, was captured by the Kurdish militia, backed by the United States, and it was also comprehensively defeated in Iraq, especially in the great battle and siege of the city of Mosul by the Iraqi military backed by the United States. And then some years ago, its ostensible leader, its nominal leader, al-Baghdadi, was assassinated, was killed in a military strike carried out by the United States in the northwestern province of Syria, of Idlib, which remains, even as of this time, outside the Syrian government's control. So ISIS is a very diminished force. Its so-called caliphate has essentially collapsed. Its so-called caliph is dead. It has not been active in the Middle East. I am not entirely clear, to be frank, what ISIS is or represents at this particular time. I have to say that because there are other organizations, terrorist organizations operating in the Middle East. Perhaps ISIS still functions. No doubt it does still function in some form. But I am surprised, perhaps, that it's carried out an attack of this kind. But of course, my surprise does not mean that it didn't actually carry out this attack. Now, the authorities in the West, the media in the West, have all, pretty much without exception, taken this claim by ISIS entirely at face value, or purportedly by ISIS entirely at face value. Well, that may be absolutely correct. I noticed that there are suggestions that the attack was carried out by a branch of ISIS called ISIS Khorasan. Khorasan is the region of Central Asia, formerly Soviet Central Asia, that used to form part of the Islamic Caliphate that existed in the early Middle Ages. And ISIS, of course, claiming, as they do, to be the successors of that caliphate, might plausibly claim that this area, the area that consists of the current republics of Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzia, Turkmenistan, and Kazakhstan, that is indeed once more part of their caliphate, and that might explain why they call themselves ISIS Khorasan. And it is undoubtedly the case that these kind of groups, the groups that ISIS today represents, have indeed been active in this area in the past. So it is possible that there is a cell or group of cells drawn from perhaps Central Asian people who are present in Russia in substantial numbers, where many of them go to work as guest workers, that a group of of these people, a cell from Central Asia, infiltrated into Russia and carried out an attack of this kind. And they might have cause to carry out such an attack. Russia has played an instrumental role in stabilizing Central Asia and defeating their kind of terrorism in Central Asia. And of course, it played an absolutely critical role in rolling up ISIS's caliphate in Syria. But having said all of that, as I said, it still surprises me a little that ISIS has returned and has this capability. If it was indeed ISIS, then that might be a sign that it has reconstituted itself in some way, perhaps now as a pure terrorist group. And one does wonder whether it will be active again, not just in Russia, but in other places as well, in which case European capitals, European countries ought to be particularly concerned about this. But anyway, there we are. I am not sure what ISIS is, who or what it represents, or how it is controlled, or who controls it. I'm not certain about any of that. And of course, it is not impossible that this claim purportedly from ISIS is simply cover behind which some other party might conceivably be operating. Now, I want to stress, I'm not saying that is the case, it's just possible. As of the time of making this program, I don't think one can exclude that possibility. There's a second point I want to make, and this is a really important one. On the 8th of March, the American and British embassies in Moscow issued a warning to US and British citizens in Russia that they had, or rather, not just in Russia, specifically in Moscow, that they had information that extremist organizations were planning some major terrorist incident in Moscow, and that this might extend to large gatherings, such as one might expect, for example, at a rock concert, and Westerners, British and American citizens, were advised to stay away from such large gatherings or potential targets. Now, that is indeed remarkable, and it suggests that the British and American governments must have had some information that a major terrorist incident was planned in Moscow. I remember discussing that warning at the time, being surprised about it, and wondering whether this was a real warning or just intended to unsettle the mood in Moscow on the eve of the presidential elections. And I remember also saying in a program in which I discussed this warning that if the Americans and the British did have information that a major terrorist incident was indeed being prepared in Moscow, then it was incumbent on them to share that information with the Russian authorities. Now, there is no information at the moment that they did provide any information to the Russian authorities. Again, I don't know that for an absolute fact, but Maria Zakharova, the Russian Foreign Ministry spokesman, yesterday made statements which seemed to me to suggest that the Russians had received no information from the Americans and the British connected to this particular warning that was made on the 8th of March. Now, if that is indeed the case, then I have to say that is extremely concerning indeed. Indeed, it is shocking. I would have thought that even in a situation of completely ruptured relations, such as we have between Russia and the Western powers at this particular time, there ought to be at least a minimal level of information sharing so that governments that have the responsibility to protect their citizens are provided with prior information that enables them to protect their citizens. To be frank and to say it straightforwardly, if the Western powers, if Britain and the United States had actual information that an incident of this kind was indeed planned in Moscow, then if they did not share that information with the Russians, and if an incident duly took place of the kind that we have seen, then frankly, the British and American governments are complicit now in that incident. I'm not saying that they were directly involved. I am saying that if they didn't share information with the Russians, thereby enabling this incident to take place, then they are complicit in it. Now, they can mitigate that by providing whatever information they now have with the Russians, which is what, by the way, Maria Zakharova invited them to do. And again, and very disturbingly and alarmingly, I get the sense that as of the time that I'm making this program, there seems to be no rush by the Americans and by the British to share their information with the Russians, if, of course, they have information. Now, I don't want to push this too far at this time. I find this perhaps the single most disturbing fact about this incident of all. But it could be that, contrary to my impressions, the Americans and the British did share information with the Russians, and that information did not suffice to prevent the kind of incident that we have just seen. So, that is also possible. But anyway, whatever. If they did not do that before, and if this attack was connected to that warning, then they are, as I said, in some way responsible for this attack. In fact, they are partly responsible for this attack, and they can at least now lessen that responsibility by providing the Russians with the information which they should have provided previously. I await to see. Now, if the British and the Americans had information, then that, of course, also opens up various other possibilities, because how and from whom did the Americans and the British obtain this information? Again, one would like to know, because that would provide us with an exceptionally strong clue as to who it was who carried out this attack. If it was ISIS, logically, this information would have come, presumably, from the Middle East. Just saying. If it came from somewhere else, then it would have come from that other place. And one wonders where that other place was, where the British and the Americans would be able to access that kind of information. So anyway, I hope and want to believe that the Americans and the British are going to set aside whatever quarrel they have with the Russians at this particular moment in time and provide the Russians with all the information that they have. I would say that if it is indeed ISIS, then given that ISIS is as likely to start terrorist attacks in other places, it is absolutely in the self-interest of Britain and the United States to share their information with the Russians. Anyway, I want to move on, because we've also had quite a lot of information over the last few hours from the Russian authorities. And the most important so far is information that has come from the Kremlin itself. And it starts with a report given to President Putin by the director of the FSB, the Federal Security Service. And we're told, this is from the Kremlin, that the director of the Federal Security Service, Alexander Bortnikov, reported to the president about the detention of 11 persons, including 4 terrorists who directly participated in the terrorist attack at Crocus City Hall. And we're also told in the same statement that the FSB is now well on the way to identifying the remaining perpetrators, the remaining people behind this attack. And we've now also had a statement from President Putin himself, as one might have expected. In the direct aftermath of this horrifying attack, President Putin addressed the Russian people. Now, much of President Putin's address is part of the work that any president of a country responsible, which has been the target of an attack like this, would be expected to make. It seeks to give support and comfort to the Russian people at a time of this, at a time when there's been an attack of this kind, give support and comfort to the families of those who have been killed or severely wounded. It makes promises that the Russian people will prevail against this kind of attack. It also says that the Russians will track down and punish those responsible. Now, I don't want to understate the importance of these words. They're absolutely critical at a time like this. A leader of a country is obligated, especially at a time like this, to address his people in that kind of way. But nonetheless, I'm going to focus on what he says about the investigation itself. And he actually provided us with quite a lot of information. And I'm taking this again from the Kremlin's website, that this address has not yet been provided with an official translation. So this is a machine translation, which I have slightly made a little more fluent than it perhaps is. Anyway, Putin said this: in Moscow and the Moscow region, in all regions of the country, additional anti-terrorism and anti-sabotage measures have been introduced. The main thing now is to prevent those who are behind this bloodbath from committing a new crime. As for the investigation of this crime and the results of operational investigative actions, at present the following can be said. All 4 direct perpetrators of the terrorist attack, all those who shot and killed people, were found and detained. They tried to hide and move towards Ukraine, where, according to preliminary data, a window was prepared for them on the Ukrainian side to cross the state border. A total of 11 people were detained. The Federal Security Service of Russia and other law enforcement agencies are working to identify and uncover the entire accomplice base of terrorists, those who provided them with transport, outlined escape routes from the crime scene, prepared caches of weapons and ammunition. And he then says, I repeat, investigative and law enforcement agencies will do everything to establish all the details of the crime, but it is already obvious that we are faced not just with a carefully, cynically prepared terrorist action, but with a prepared and organized mass murder of peaceful, defenseless people. And then he makes comparisons between the actions that these terrorists carried out and the actions of the Nazis, who, as he says, once carried out massacres in the occupied territories, in the territories they occupied. And that the terrorists, just like the Nazis, decided to stage a show execution, a bloody act of intimidation. Now, there's a number of very important points here. The first, which is the one that many people have focused on, and not wrongly, by the way, is that Putin says that the perpetrators of this attack, the people who actually carried out the attack, have not only been captured, the actual gunmen have not only been captured, but that they were trying to escape towards Ukraine. And there are reports in the Russian media that these 4 individuals were actually arrested by the Russian authorities. They were captured by the Russian authorities in Bryansk region, through which they were transiting on the way to Ukraine. Now, Putin also says that according to preliminary data, a window was prepared for them on the Ukrainian side to cross the state border. In other words, that there was an access point which would have allowed them to travel from Russia into Ukraine. Now, that, I have to say, hints and appears to be intended to hint that the Ukrainian authorities are somehow implicated in this affair. And Putin also, of course, refers to the Nazis and the fact that they've carried out the attack that was carried out is somehow resembles the mass murders that the Germans carried out during the Second World War. And of course, Putin has equated the authorities in Kiev with the Nazis. He recently referred to the government, the Ukrainian government, as the neo-Nazi regime in Kiev. So these words of Putin's heavily hint at some involvement by the Ukrainian authorities. Not just involvement, but direct complicity. Now, it's important to say that they hint at it, they don't actually say it. We don't yet know for a fact that this is so. Merely because Putin hints at something, it doesn't necessarily follow that this is true. The Ukrainian authorities, and by the way, governments and officials and commentators in the West, unanimously, indignantly reject any suggestion that the Ukrainian authorities would be involved in an attack of this kind. And the Ukrainian authorities themselves, some of them, especially in the early hours after this incident took place, there were some claims circulating in Ukraine that this was actually a Russian false flag, that the Russians carried out this attack against themselves in order to justify further action against Ukraine. By the way, that is one theory that I think is wrong to the point of absurdity, and I'm not going to pursue it further. I want to stress again that I have no idea at all about who I don't have any knowledge, I should say, of who carried out this attack. But there is one fact about this information, the information provided by the FSB by Bortnikov, the Federal Security Service of Russia, to Putin, and by Putin himself in this address that he's made to the Russian people, which does stand out for me. This is not so much that these people were trying to escape towards Ukraine. It's that they were trying to escape at all. That not only were they trying to escape, but that they allowed themselves to be captured alive. This is what the Russian authorities claim, that they allowed themselves to be captured alive by the Russian authorities. Now, I'm not saying that that proves that they were not acting on behalf of ISIS, but I would have expected that operatives of ISIS carrying out an attack of this kind would not have let themselves be taken alive. That is inconsistent with what I know of ISIS's modus operandi. When they send people to carry out these kind of attacks, normally it's expected that these people would be prepared to kill themselves rather than let themselves be captured. The fact that the Russian authorities say that these people were captured doesn't disprove that ISIS was involved, but it does, for me, place a question mark over that claim. And, of course, if they were trying to flee, Ukraine would be an obvious place that they would try to flee towards. But, of course, Putin is hinting that it went further than that. Now, I have no information that the Ukrainian authorities were involved in this affair. Again, I want to say that. But if I'm sure that there are going to be an awful lot of people in Russia who will assume that they were, and who will take these hints provided by Putin as confirmation that they were. And I have to say this, if people do come to those assumptions in Russia, they might be completely wrong assumptions. They might be identifying the wrong party, but the Ukrainians have had a history of carrying out attacks on civilian targets in Russia. We had an article a couple of weeks ago in the New York Times telling us about this. And there's been histories of murders and assassinations. And it's not surprising, in light of that, that some people in Russia, a lot of people in Russia, will read these hints of Putin's and connect the Ukrainians in light of that history with what has just happened. I sincerely hope that they are wrong. I'd like to believe that they are wrong, but Putin's statements do beg questions to which I hope we will get some answers. Anyway, that is what I'm going to say about this incident so far. We have heard from the Russians that they have captured the people who carried out this attack. We have heard from the Russians that they have captured, or at least arrested, 11 other people, that they're working to, in Putin's words, identify and uncover the entire accomplice base of the terrorists, those who provided them with transport, outlined escape routes from the crime scene, prepared caches with weapons and ammunition. Whoever was involved, whoever was behind this thing, if what Putin and the FSB saying are true, and I'm sure it is, by the way, then they need to be aware that within a few hours or days, perhaps already, the Russians will have pieced together the whole story behind this affair and will have a fully clear idea of who it was who was responsible. That makes it even more imperative that the Americans and the British come forward and confirm the information that they have. If they don't, inevitably some people will say that the British and the Americans don't want the identities of the perpetrators to be fully confirmed. Well, as those of you who know me will be aware, I have chosen my words in the last couple of sentences that I have uttered very carefully. I always have to worry about sensitivities. This is a terrible tragedy, a horrible thing that has happened. It is, in my opinion, only going to consolidate Russian society even more strongly behind President Putin and his government. I've, as a matter of fact, been in Moscow when terrorist incidents took place there in the early 2000s. I was actually in Moscow, for example, during the Beslan events, when that school was seized by jihadi terrorists in the northern Caucasus, in northern Ossetia. And it was noticeable even then to me, as an observer, how the events simply created a kind of stiffening of public will. And I am sure the same will happen this time. So if this was an attempt by someone to intimidate or destabilize Russia, I can confidently say it will do the opposite. And as I said, if somebody who is not directly involved has information about this incident, specifically the American and British governments, then it is in their very strong interests to share it. This is what I'm going to say about this incident up to now. To repeat again, this is a horrific affair, ruthlessly and savagely carried out, a murderous attack on entirely innocent people, civilians, revelers at a festival, a shocking event. It should be condemned unequivocally. I ought to say that I'm, frankly, already somewhat dismayed by the fact that the condemnation that has been coming from some quarters in the West strikes me as being incredibly tepid, given the horror of what has happened. From the rest of the world, by the way, it has been otherwise. World leaders have been lining up to send messages of condolence and support and horror to the Russians. But anyway, we will certainly know a lot more about this incident over the next couple of days. And if the Russians are to be believed, and I have no reason not to believe them, they have already broken the case. They have already, to all intents and purposes, got the people who will lead them to the truth about this case. Now, the events that have happened in Moscow, horrifying as they are not the only events relating to Russia that are taking place in the world. Lots of other things also taking place around the world. Situation in the Middle East, for example, remains incredibly precarious. But since we've been talking about Russia, and it is to Russia and to Russian-related affairs that I will now turn. The first is that we have had more very important news from the battlefronts. And this came in a report from the Russian Defense Ministry. This morning, we learn that this morning, the Russian military captured the town of the village of Ivanivske to the west of Bakhmut. Confirmation came from the Russian Defense Ministry, and it informs us, the Russian Defense Ministry have informed us that that Ivanivske is now under Russian control. This is big news. It opens the way for the potential capture of Chasiv Yar further west, and it also points to the collapse of the Ukrainian defenses around Klishevka and Andreevka to the south. These are the words of the Russian Defense Ministry in their bulletin that they've given this morning. Units of the Yug group of forces liberated Krasnoye. Krasnoye is the name the Russians give to Ivanivske, and improved the tactical situation on the front line. Airstrikes and artillery fire defeated units of the 42nd Mechanized, 17th Tank, 92nd Assault, 79th Air Assault, 46th, 81st Airborne Brigades close to Klishevka, Kurdyumovka, Paraskovievka, and Krasnogorovka. These are all places basically in the Bakhmut area. And the Russian Defense Ministry yesterday gave us reports about the fighting in this area as well. And they informed us that the Russian military had not only, this is before the capture of Ivanivske, they also informed us that another place, important location in the area of Ivanivske, had also been captured, and this came from the weekly summary that the Russian Defense Ministry provided yesterday. They said that the Yug group of forces liberated the Alebastrovaya railway station and improved the situation along the front line, which means that the Russians have basically captured the railway line in the Klishevka area and have crossed it, and now east, confirmed to be east of the railway line. So in the entire Bakhmut area, Ukrainian defenses are starting to collapse. Ivanivske has fallen. If Ivanivske falls, the way is open to Chasov Yar. Further south of Ivanivske, Klishevka, Ukrainian positions in Klishevka and Andreevka are now undefendable. A collapse there is likely to happen fairly quickly, and with Ivanivske having fallen, it seems to me that it is now only a matter of time before the other village of Bogdanovka, further north, falls as well. So the Russians are close to completing what might be described as the Battle of Bakhmut, at least the epilogue to the Battle of Bakhmut. Bakhmut itself, of course, was captured in May 2023 by the Wagner Group. The Ukrainians subsequently carried out a major counterattack in the area of Bakhmut. We even talked at one time, as I remember, back in the summer, that the Ukrainians had taken Bakhmut in a semicircle and were close to recapturing parts of Bakhmut, or at least western Bakhmut, west of a river that flows through Bakhmut. Of course, none of that proved to be correct. The Russian positions overall held. The Ukrainians did regain some ground. They now have lost pretty much all the ground that they regained during the counterattack around Bakhmut, a counterattack in which the Ukrainians suffered hideous losses. And the Russians, having repelled that counterattack, are now themselves advancing. They took Khromovo some weeks ago. They've now taken Ivanivske, Krasnoye, as they call it. They will soon have Bogdanovka as well. They will soon reach the canal, the Chasov Yar canal. And the widespread expectation now, and consistent with the massive bombing that the Russians are conducting in this area, is that having reached the canal, the Russians will press on west, they will cross the canal, and they will seek to capture Chasov Yar A small town, around 12,000 people. It is on high ground, but apparently its conditions make it difficult to defend. That is what several Ukrainian soldiers have said. Once Chasiv Yar is captured by the Russians have one town left, Konstantinovka, west of Chasiv Yar, one town further to capture, and beyond that, they've reached Kramatorsk, which is one of the major towns still under Ukrainian control in the northern Donbass. So, a big event, the capture of Ivanivske, was always, by the way, said to be the most difficult of the villages around Bakhmut for the Russians to capture. It had been heavily fortified by the Ukrainians, and in addition, it is surrounded by wooded areas, which made the movement of troops into Ivanivske particularly difficult. And as has been explained to us many times by Dima at the Military Summary Channel, there was a hill that overlooked part of Ivanivske, which the Ukrainians had control of, which also made the capture of Ivanivske more difficult still. Yesterday, we got reports that the hill had been captured by the Russians, and that seems to be undisputed, and the capture of the hill has led, as Dima at the Military Summary Channel always said it would, to the collapse, the fall of Ivanivske. So, an important event on the Bakhmut battle lines. Another important piece on the checkerboard has now been taken by the Russians. And we're also getting further reports that the Russians are now pushing forward hard in the Avdiivka area. They have captured Orlovka and Tonenka over the last couple of days. There are multiple reports pouring in that they are moving now well to the west of Tonenka. Again, if you look at the map, there are few natural barriers, in fact, very few barriers at all, standing in the way of the Russians. In the immediate area west of Tonenka, the Russians are rapidly moving to occupy the fields and the ground around Tonenka. Once they have occupied this territory, they'll be in a very strong position to increase significantly the pressure on Pervomaiske, the town, 28,000 people before the war, to the southwest of Avdiivka. And it looks to me as if the days of Pervomaiske now are definitely numbered as well. And as I've said, if Pervomaiske falls, Krasnogorovka, further south, becomes undefendable as well. And changing the gaming metaphor, we'll see not just more pieces taken on the checkerboard, but perhaps a whole row of places fall one after the other, like a row of dominoes. So, lots of important things happening there as well. Now, there's other reports from other parts of the battlefronts as well. All of the information, accumulating information, is bad. We've had reports now that the Russians have finally begun the attack, the assault on Terny, this village on the east bank of the Zherebets River in the north. It's likely that Terny will fall, probably within a relatively short time. It is a very small place, judging from the map. I gather about 500 people before the war. And the universal assumption is that if Terny falls, all the other villages are strung out on the east bank of the actually rather small Zherebets River will fall also. So, bad news for the Ukrainians there as well. there are reports that Ukrainian defenses, that the Russians rather, are resuming their attacks in Novomikhailivka, and that the pressure there is increasing. So it looks like Novomikhailivka likely to fall as well within the next couple of days. And there's lots of reports that the Russians are now making significant attacks towards the town of Siversk, north of Bakhmut, that they're in the process of attacking a village called Razdolovka. If Razdolovka is captured, that's another important piece, again, on the checkerboard, with Razdolovka under Russian control, with Belogorovka apparently also in the process of being attacked and eventually captured by the Russians. That opens the way for the Russians to capture Siversk, small but important town, fortified town that the Ukrainians hold in northern Donbass. If the Russians capture it, they've never captured it at any earlier point in the conflict, but if the Russians capture it, then they're in a strong position to not only recapture Liman to the west, beyond the Zherebets River, but when they do resume the offensive to Kupiansk and Izium, which everybody expects that they will, then their advance this time towards these towns in Kharkiv region, southern Kharkiv region, will be more firmly anchored because they will have Siversk under control. So, Russian advance is continuing, and reports from the Ukrainians today and yesterday that the Russians have gathered together a force of around 100,000 men, which they have available as an operational reserve in order to carry out an offensive somewhere along the combat line, wherever it is that they choose to strike. The Ukrainians have made these claims before, by the way, about these large concentrations of Russian troops in various places and locations, and they've given us reasons to suppose that Russian attacks, offensives are about to begin, but it's never quite exactly worked out in that way. Well, might be different this time. It could be the case that there will be a offensive this time. I saw a report somewhere that the BITCHUTE is indeed underway in Ukraine at this particular time. So all of these Russian advances, all these checkerboard places, all these pieces that have been taken on the Ukrainian checkerboard, all these Russian offensive actions that we've been talking about, the capture of Tonenka and Orlovka, the capture of Mirnoye in Zaporozhye region. There's some reports, by the way, that the Russians are now very close to Staromayorsk in the Vremivka salient area as well. The Russian capture of Ivanivske, their advances through the fields near Bakhmut and Avdiivka. All of this is happening despite the fact that we are in the BITCHUTE season. In April, the ground is going to harden, and that will make armoured advances cross-country easier. And of course, we had the report yesterday about Fab 3000 bombs becoming available. So perhaps a Russian offensive of some sort is indeed just weeks away. Just saying. Anyway, I'm going to return now to the subject of the Russian missile strikes, because we have now had a series of very interesting reports about this from the Russian Defense Ministry, and I'm going to read what they say. Firstly, this is a report that was published yesterday. Today, the Russian armed forces carried out a massive, notice that even the Russians say it was a massive, long-range, air-launched, sea-launched, ground-based and unmanned aerial attack against power facilities, that was the energy system, military-industrial complex, railroad hubs, arsenals, deployment areas of Ukrainian troops and foreign mercenaries. The strike disrupted the functioning of the manufacturing enterprises involved in issuing and repairing weapons, military hardware, and ammunition. Foreign military equipment and weapons delivered to Ukraine from NATO countries has been destroyed. The transfer of enemy reserves to the front line has been disrupted, and Ukrainian and mercenary units have been neutralized in reconstitution areas. So that is a description and an explanation of the big strike that took place on Thursday night and early on Friday morning. An immensely complicated strike involving lots of missiles. By the way, importantly, it turns out that some of these missiles were launched across Ukraine. They flew from one end of Ukraine to the other. They almost reached the western boundary of Ukraine, and then they turned back. And apparently they have the range and the guidance systems that enable them to do that. And then they pounded and hit the Ukrainian positions, attacking Ukrainians from the rear. And it's been pointed out by a number of people that Patriot missile systems point in only one direction and can only engage targets in one direction, and they would be presumably pointing towards the east and might not be expecting an attack from the west. Anyway, that was yesterday. That was the strike that I discussed yesterday. And we see what the Russians say they attacked. They say they just attacked power facilities, the military-industrial complex, railroad hubs, arsenals, deployment areas of Ukrainian troops, and foreign mercenaries. And the purpose was to disrupt the functioning of manufacturing enterprises involved in producing and repairing weapons, and of destroying military hardware and ammunition, and of destroying depots with equipment supplied by the West, and also of attacking the retraining and deployment places of Ukrainian military units. So this enormous strike, 63 drones apparently. Ukrainians claim that they shot down 58 of them. Large numbers of missiles. The Ukrainians have given some surprising claims for the numbers of missiles that they claim to have destroyed, especially KH-101s. But observers who have been watching and examining the film, observers of these strikes and people who've examined the films of these strikes, have commented, on the contrary, on the almost complete absence of the Ukrainian air defense system as the strike, this massive strike, what the Russians themselves call a massive strike, was underway, suggesting again that the Ukrainian air defense system is now essentially fragmenting and in pieces, enabling the Russians to launch strikes like this wherever they want, in whatever way they wish. But anyway, this massive strike intended to disrupt the energy system. The Russians say that it also interfered with railway hubs and the transportation of troops. So it was clearly intended to affect the movement of the electric-powered trains across Ukraine, and that they also struck at the concentrations of Ukrainian troops. So that was one strike, the big one, the one that I discussed yesterday. But the Russians also say something about the strike that they carried out on the previous day. And they say this: in response to shelling of Russian territory, attempts to break through and capture Russian border settlements, the Russian armed forces carried out 49 high precision strikes, including Kinjal hypersonic missiles, missile systems, and unmanned aerial vehicles. So that was the strike that took place on the previous day. And they said the strikes hit Ukrainian decision-making centers, airfield infrastructure, an armament and military hardware repair workshop, drone storage depots, and uncrewed surface vehicles, logistic support bases, as well as temporary deployments of special forces and foreign mercenaries. The key is, again, the reference to decision-making centers. Clearly, the missile strike on the previous day was retaliation and a response to the Ukrainian attempts to attack and capture places, villages on the Russian border. And about those attacks, the attacks on Belgorod and Kursk region, the Russian Defense Ministry says this: Ukrainian fighters attempted to breach the border areas of Belgorod and Kursk region. All attacks have been repelled. In Belgorod direction, more than 3,000 Ukrainian servicemen, 7 tanks, 15 armored vehicles, and 17 motor vehicles of the Ukrainian forces were eliminated during the week. 3,000? That's more than the Russian Defense Ministry has claimed in the past. They seem to be revising upwards their figures. If this is true, then the attempt to capture those border villages that the Ukrainians have made was a total disaster. Elsewhere, the Russians also claim that they have destroyed 9 Czech-made Vampire multiple launch rocket systems and 1 German Iris-T air defense system. And I understand that this was all happened, again, in the areas close to the border as part of these battles in the border. And if it's correct, again, these Russian claims are correct, then Ukraine has perhaps lost half of the Vampire multiple launch rocket systems that they were supplied by the Czech Republic over the course of this war. So, an absolute disaster for the Ukrainians on the border. Well, there we go. There are many who are saying that this combination of Russian missile strikes, the collapse of the Ukrainian air defense system, and the Russian breakthroughs on the front line, that they all speak about an imminent collapse on the part of Ukraine, on the battlefronts, that the end of the war is now not so much in sight, but coming closer. Well, I'm not in a position to comment about this one way or the other. It does seem to me that the Russians, however, do have the initiative and that they are now pressing hard. And it could be that we are close to that point. But perhaps it's nonetheless important to remember that the Ukrainians are still resisting, and they do seem to have, the Ukrainian army does still seem to have some fight left in it. So I would expect this thing to drag on, to continue for at least several more months, unless, of course, some decision is finally made in Kiev to seek a negotiated outcome to the war, of which I must say I see no sign. Now, this essentially ends my commentary about the war news, the Ukrainian war news. I do want to return again briefly to a topic I discussed at length yesterday, which is Peskov's comment about Russia being at war. There's been much discussion about this in the West. I think that it is nonetheless important to restate again a point that I made in my program yesterday, that Peskov actually walked back the statement. He went out of his way to say that Russia is not legally at war. It is still a special military operation. As I said in my program yesterday, I think Peskov perhaps inadvertently lifted the curtain on discussions that are taking place in the Kremlin. It could be that the Russians plan at some point over the next few months to upgrade the status of the war, that they have not yet done that. And I think people who have rushed to conclusions based on what Peskov said might be at risk of overemphasizing and perhaps overanalyzing. Now, I'm going to now return and finish this program with a brief discussion about the state of the Russian economy, because yesterday we had a decision by the Russian Central Bank to keep interest rates at 16%, the key rate at 16%. And this came along with a statement from Elvira Nabiullina, the head of the central bank. And it gives us a great deal of information, insight about the situation within the Russian economy. And she said over the course of this statement that current price growth slowed down notably in December and January. The deceleration paused in February, but according to preliminary estimates, resumed in March. And she indicated that it's important, despite the fact that the indicators are that inflation is falling, to stick to the current interest rate position. She said that according to our estimates, underlying current price growth has been in the range of 6 to 7% in annualized terms since the beginning of the year, that this is a lot better than the double-digit growth in inflation that was the case in the late summer and early fall of last year. She also said that the increase in inflation in February, or rather the pause in the fall of inflation in February, was due to one factor, which is high seasonal demand for tourism services, and that had this factor not been there, inflation would not have increased in February. And that factor has now passed. And she says that she expects that inflation by the end of the year will fall back to the target of 4 to 4.5% and stabilize at this target further on. So she is, on balance, reasonably optimistic about the inflation picture. And then she talks about the situation in the economy as a whole. And she says this: after a slight deceleration at the end of 2023, according to our estimates, the growth of economic activity has sped up again, primarily in household consumption. Growth in retail is a sign of elevated consumer demand. Consumer sentiment is close to record highs. households' propensity to make large purchases has been increasing since December. We never observed such trends during the previous periods of considerable monetary policy tightening. Investment activity has hit a record high. Although we have not yet received quarterly data, this is evident from indirect indicators. The output of investment goods has reached historically high levels. The import of investment goods has been expanding. Finally, our regional branches report a higher percentage of companies that have increased their production targets. The economy is in the investment phase of growth, which is one of the manifestations of structural transformation. All this supports high business activity. The Business Climate Index rose to its 12-year maximum. Such a significant increase is associated with the fact that the economy is using almost all production capabilities and labor resources. Surveys show that the utilization rate of production capacities reached a record high of 81% at the end of last year. This trend was registered in many regions. So, coming back to the trope that we have all across the West, that this expansion that we've seen in the economy is largely due to defense spending. Clearly, that is a part of it. But Nabulina, who is in the best position to know, tells us that what is driving economic activity fastest are two things: very high consumer demand and a huge surge in investment, which is now at record levels. And she expresses astonishment that this is the case, given how high interest rates currently are. She does express concerns. She says that the unemployment rate has now declined to just 2.7%. The labour market tightness has started to increase again. According to business surveys, the labour shortages have worsened the most in metallurgy, the pharmaceutical and chemical industries, as well as the mining and quarrying sector. Companies' competition for labour resources has been intensifying in such conditions. And that she's worried, again, that a tightening labour market could lead eventually to higher inflation. But she also says that there has been an increase in savings. The saving ratio remains high. The increase in deposits significantly surpasses normal seasonal dynamics, which is largely driven by higher incomes. We are currently observing a rather unusual situation when the surge in savings is accompanied by growing consumption. We expect that in the future, the accumulated effect of tightening monetary conditions will encourage people to save even more, which will contribute to a more notable deceleration of inflation. So there are still a significant problem in terms of a very tight labour situation, which is still acting as a stimulus for inflation, though she nonetheless believes that inflation this year is going to continue to fall. But she sees the primary growth drivers in the economy as a major investment surge, leading to higher output, leading to higher wages, leading to increased consumption, which of course explain the investment growth. Some economists might describe this as a virtuous cycle. It's not that different, by the way, from the collection of policies that became established in the United States in the late 19th century and came to form the American system. High growth, anchored on high wages and high investment. We'll see how far it goes in Russia's case, but let me repeat again. Claims that this is a one-dimensional economy based entirely on accelerated defense spending are not what the chairman of the Russian Central Bank tell us that we are seeing. Well, this is where I end my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget to check out our shop. You will see there that we are selling lots of products to commemorate Greek Independence Day. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.